In ancient Rome, power did not always wear armor or speak from marble steps. Sometimes it moved quietly, wrapped in white cloth, carrying no weapon at all. Before you drift any deeper, if this quiet helps you feel safe tonight, you're welcome to stay with us. Subscribing softly keeps this place gentle and lets these nights continue. Now, rest. While generals marched and senators argued, 6 young women stood beside a fire that was never allowed to fade. Their presence was believed to steady the city itself. If they were calm, Rome was calm. If they failed, Rome feared the universe would notice. Tonight's story is not about conquest or collapse, but about responsibility placed far too early and carried for far too long. Who were the Vestal Virgins, and what was their job, and more? To understand the Vestal Virgins, it helps to first understand Rome's mindset. Ancient Rome was not a society that trusted chance. Nothing important was allowed to feel random. Success, disaster, victory, and failure all required explanation, preferably one that involved ritual, symbolism, and someone to hold responsible if things went wrong. The Vestal Virgins existed precisely within that need. They were not merely priestesses. They were a stabilizing idea, a visible assurance that the city was still aligned with forces beyond human control. The Vestals served the goddess Vesta, guardian of the hearth, home, and continuity. In Roman thinking, the hearth was not just a place for warmth. It represented family order, civic stability, and the survival of the state itself. The fire of Vesta was believed to mirror the life of Rome. As long as it burned, the city endured. If it failed, people assumed something far worse would follow. This belief made the caretakers of that fire uniquely important. Unlike many religious roles in Rome, becoming a Vestal Virgin was not a personal calling. It was an appointment made by the state. Girls were selected young, usually between 6 and 10 years old, taken from noble families considered suitable in status and reputation. The selection was formal, public, and irreversible. From that moment forward, the child ceased to belong to her family. She belonged to Rome. This separation was complete. The Vestal left her home permanently and entered the Temple of Vesta and the house of the Vestals near the Roman Forum. Her hair was cut, her clothing changed, and her identity reshaped. Rome understood symbolism well, and it used it relentlessly. Childhood was not simply left behind. It was ceremonially removed. The Vestals lived in conditions that appeared luxurious by Roman standards. Their residence contained gardens, fountains, private rooms, servants, and security. Compared to most Roman women whose lives were legally restricted and socially supervised, the Vestals possessed remarkable privileges. They could own property, manage wealth, write wills, and move through the city without male guardianship. In public ceremonies, they received places of honor. Even high-ranking officials deferred to them. Yet this comfort masked a deeper reality. The Vestals lived under constant observation. Their behavior, posture, expressions, and routines were scrutinized not only by priests, but by the entire city. They were symbols. Before they were people, their role required calm at all times, precision in every action, and absolute adherence to ritual order. A Vestal was expected to appear steady, regardless of circumstance, because Rome believed instability was contagious. Their primary duty was deceptively simple: maintain the sacred flame of Vesta. The fire burned continuously day and night, tended in shifts. Allowing it to extinguish was considered a serious failure. It did not matter whether wind, weather, or accident played a role. Rome did not treat mishaps as neutral events. Something had to be at fault. More often than not, responsibility fell on the vestal assigned to the fire. This duty extended beyond physical maintenance. The flame represented continuity, and continuity required repetition without error. The vestals performed rituals exactly as prescribed, using precise movements, words, and timing. Roman religion placed enormous importance on correct procedure. A ritual performed incorrectly was believed to be worse than no ritual at all. Training reflected this obsession with precision. A vestal's service lasted 30 years, divided into 3 stages. The first 10 years were devoted to learning. During this period, young vestals memorized rituals, learned ceremonial conduct, and practiced maintaining composure. The second decade was active service, where they performed duties independently. The final 10 years were spent instructing new initiates, passing down experience accumulated under decades of pressure. Despite their privileges, vestals were also burdened with restrictions unmatched in Roman society. They were required to maintain absolute chastity for the duration of their service. This rule was not framed as personal morality, but as a condition for cosmic balance. Roman belief held that a vestal's purity was directly linked to the stability of the state. Whether or not this logic made sense was irrelevant. It was accepted. The consequences of suspicion were severe. A vestal accused of breaking her vow faced public trial and, if convicted, burial alive. The punishment was designed to avoid direct execution, as the vestal was considered sacred. Rome resolved this contradiction by isolating her underground, supplying minimal provisions, and sealing the chamber. Responsibility was technically transferred to fate. The city absolved itself. Accusations were not rare. Political tension, military setbacks, natural disasters, or public anxiety often created an appetite for blame. The vestals, visible and symbolically loaded, became convenient targets. Their elevated status did not protect them. It intensified scrutiny. And yet, for centuries, the system persisted. Through wars, internal conflict, and political transformation, the vestals maintained their role. Their continued presence reassured Romans that some order remained untouched by ambition and chaos. Even when Rome changed emperors, expanded borders, or collapsed internally, the fire continued to burn. The end of the Vestal Virgins did not come through scandal or failure. It came quietly through reform. In the late 4th century, as Christianity reshaped Roman identity, traditional pagan institutions lost state support. The Temple of Vesta was closed, the flame extinguished not by accident but by decision. Rome did not collapse immediately afterward, as many had feared. Life continued. The Vestal Virgins faded into history, not because they failed, but because the world that required them no longer existed. And yet their story remains. Not as a tale of religion, but as a study of how societies assign meaning, manage fear, and place extraordinary responsibility on a very small number of lives, then call it stability. Vestal Virgins, Rome's quiet system of emotional stability. Ancient Rome liked to imagine itself as disciplined, rational, and guided by law. It built roads that still exist, aqueducts that still inspire engineers, and legal codes that shaped entire civilizations. Yet beneath that polished surface lived a deep and persistent anxiety. Rome did not trust luck. It did not trust coincidence. and it certainly did not trust the idea that an empire might survive without constant reassurance that the universe was still on its side. That reassurance took many forms. Omens were read in bird flights. Decisions were delayed because of thunder. Entire policies were reconsidered because a chicken refused to eat. But none of these comforts were as effective as the Vestal Virgins. They were not warriors. They did not govern. They did not vote. And yet, for centuries, Rome treated them as its most reliable emotional anchor. The Vestal Virgins were a small group of women whose existence reassured Rome that order still existed somewhere. Their job was not to fix problems, but to prevent panic. As long as they performed their duties calmly and correctly, Rome believed everything else would eventually fall back into place. If they remained composed, the city felt protected. If they faltered, the city assumed catastrophe was already on its way. This belief placed enormous weight on very quiet shoulders. The Vestals served Vesta, the goddess of the hearth. But in Roman thinking, the hearth was not merely a domestic symbol. It was the center of continuity. A household without a hearth was unstable. A city without a hearth was doomed. The sacred flame of Vesta represented Rome's inner life, the part of the city that was supposed to endure while everything else changed. Keeping that flame alive became a matter of civic survival. Rome's solution was elegant in theory and unsettling in practice. It selected girls at a young age before they could form attachments or ambitions that might interfere with duty. These girls were removed from their families through formal ritual, praised publicly, and then quietly absorbed into a system that would define every aspect of their lives for the next 30 years. Rome called this an honor, and in many ways, it was. Vestal virgins enjoyed privileges that most Roman women could never imagine. They could own property, they could manage wealth, they could walk through the city without male supervision. Their testimony carried unusual weight in court. They were given seats of honor at public events. Even powerful men lowered their voices in their presence. But privilege in Rome always came with conditions. The Vestals were not powerful because they were trusted. They were powerful because they were feared. Rome feared disorder more than injustice. It feared chaos more than cruelty. And the Vestals existed as a visible reminder that chaos was being held at bay, not by armies or laws, but by ritual precision and personal restraint. Their most important task was the maintenance of the sacred fire. On the surface, this was a practical duty. Fire needs tending. Wood must be added. Ash must be cleared. But in Rome, nothing remained practical for long. The flame became symbolic of everything Rome wanted to believe about itself. As long as it burned, Rome was protected. If it went out, the universe had noticed something it did not like. This meant mistakes were not allowed. If the fire faltered, no one asked whether the wind was strong or the weather uncooperative. Rome did not believe in neutral causes. Someone had failed, and the Vestal responsible would be reminded of that failure in ways designed to reassure the public that accountability still existed. The irony, of course, was that the Vestals were asked to maintain absolute calm in a city that was rarely calm itself. Rome expanded, conquered, collapsed into civil war, reinvented itself, and repeated the cycle. Through all of this, the Vestals were expected to remain steady. Their expressions mattered. Their posture mattered. Their silence mattered. They were not allowed to reflect the city's anxiety. They were meant to absorb it. This role turned them into something like Rome's emotional buffer. When things went well, they were praised. When things went poorly, they were scrutinized. If harvests failed, people looked at the Vestals. If omens seemed unfavorable, people watched the Vestals more closely. The logic was simple and deeply unfair. If the symbol of stability showed even the slightest crack, the instability must already be spreading. And then there was chastity. Rome insisted that Vestals remain sexually untouched for the entirety of their service. This requirement was not about personal virtue. It was about control. A Vestal's body became another symbol Rome monitored obsessively, convinced that private behavior could somehow destabilize public order. No one ever explained how this worked. Rome rarely felt the need to explain its fears. It simply enforced them. Accusations did not require evidence so much as atmosphere. A bad year, a political rivalry, a string of uncomfortable events could suddenly produce suspicion. And suspicion, once formed, was difficult to undo. Rome preferred certainty, even when that certainty was built on assumption. Punishments were severe, but carefully framed. Rome took pride in being civilized, which meant avoiding the appearance of brutality while still delivering its message. Vestals found guilty of violating their vows were not executed directly. They were placed underground and sealed away, as if the city could outsource responsibility to fate. It was an elegant moral loophole. Rome did not kill its symbols. It simply removed them. Yet despite this ever-present threat, the Vestal system endured for centuries. The women adapted. They learned stillness. They learned how to exist without attracting attention. They mastered the art of being present without being visible. Success for a Vestal meant nothing happening at all. And Rome loved that. Eventually the world changed. New beliefs replaced old ones. Rome discovered that it could survive without its ancient symbols. The temple closed. The fire went out, deliberately this time. And nothing immediate happened. The city did not collapse. The sky did not fall. Life continued, slightly quieter, slightly different. The Vestal Virgins did not disappear because they failed. They disappeared because Rome no longer needed them to manage its fear. Their story remains unsettling not because of what they did, but because of what they represented. A society that placed immense responsibility on a few carefully chosen lives. A system that rewarded obedience and punished deviation. A belief that stability could be manufactured through ritual rather than justice. The Vestal Virgins were not Rome's strength. They were Rome's coping mechanism. And for a civilization that never truly relaxed, that may have been the most revealing role of all. Chosen without asking. Rome had many ways of taking things from people. Land could be seized, wealth could be taxed, sons could be drafted, but few acts were as quietly absolute as the way it took its Vestal Virgins. There were no negotiations, no appeals, no second opinions. The decision arrived already complete. The girl was young, usually between 6 and 10 years old, an age when life still revolved around routine, familiarity, and the expectation that tomorrow would look much like today. Rome preferred this age. Younger minds bent more easily. Younger memories faded faster. Older children might hesitate. Older children might ask questions. Rome did not like questions. The selection process was called captio. The word translates politely as taking. Less politely, it means seizure. Rome, to its credit, did not disguise this part. It wrapped the act in ritual and dignity, but it never pretended the girl was choosing anything. The Pontifex Maximus, Rome's highest religious authority, arrived with officials and witnesses. He did not knock as a guest. He entered as the state. The family stood aside. The girl was identified. A declaration was spoken. And just like that, her previous life ended. Rome described this moment as an honor. Families were encouraged to feel proud. After all, their daughter had been selected to serve the gods and the city. The implication was clear. Refusal was unthinkable, not because it was illegal in a narrow sense, but because it challenged the assumption that Rome knew best. Parents had no formal right to object. There was no appeal process, no moment of private discussion. The girl was not asked whether she wished to go. Consent was irrelevant. Rome believed duty preceded desire, especially for children, and especially for girls. The criteria for selection were revealing. The child had to come from a respectable family. Her parents needed to be alive. Her body had to show no visible imperfection. Rome was deeply uncomfortable with the idea that the gods might be represented by anything less than visual symmetry. A limp, a stutter, or an illness was enough to disqualify a candidate. This was not cruelty, Rome insisted. It was practicality. The universe, after all, was famously picky. Mental qualities mattered as well. The girl needed to be calm, quiet, and compliant. Temperament was evaluated not for happiness or well-being, but for predictability. Rome valued stability above all else. Emotional intensity was a liability. Curiosity was suspicious. Strong will was unnecessary. Once selected, the transition was immediate. There were no long goodbyes, no gradual adjustment. Delay only invited doubt. The girl was escorted away from her home in a formal procession. Crowds gathered. Blessings were murmured. Onlookers congratulated the family while privately thanking every god available that the choice had landed elsewhere. The girl walked forward, small and carefully guided, wearing clothing that marked her separation from ordinary life. She did not yet understand what she was leaving. That, too, was intentional. Upon arrival at the Temple of Vesta, the final separation occurred. Her hair was cut. This was not merely a practical change. Hair symbolized identity, family ties, and childhood. By cutting it, Rome performed a visible erasure. The locks were buried or preserved, a symbolic funeral for a life that had not technically ended but was no longer accessible. From that moment on, the girl belonged to the state. Rome preferred to describe this as belonging to the gods. But the distinction was mostly theoretical. The state defined the gods' wishes. The state enforced their rules. And the state benefited most from the Vestal's obedience. She was given new clothing, plain and uniform. Individual expression was discouraged. Uniformity reduced unpredictability. Predictability reassured Rome. The girl's legal identity changed as well. She was no longer under her father's authority. Instead, she came under the supervision of religious officials. This transfer was described as liberation, and technically it was. The Vestal would one day enjoy freedoms other Roman women could not. But at the moment of selection, freedom was not the point. Control was. The irony is that Rome justified this coercion by claiming necessity. The Vestals were essential. Their presence ensured stability. Therefore, the argument went, any sacrifice required to create them was acceptable, including the childhood of the girl herself. This logic was rarely questioned. What Rome did not discuss openly was the psychological weight of this sudden transformation. The girl entered an environment of quiet rules and unspoken expectations. She was surrounded by adults who behaved with ritualized calm. She learned quickly that questions were unwelcome. Curiosity disrupted rhythm. Emotion disrupted ceremony. She was praised for stillness, rewarded for silence, corrected for distraction. Rome believed this training created discipline, and it did. But it also created distance. The girl learned to observe herself carefully, to regulate expression, to understand that her behavior carried meaning beyond intention. She was no longer simply herself. She was a symbol in training. The separation from family was total. Visits were not part of the system. Letters were unnecessary. Memory, Rome assumed, would fade. And if it did not, the discipline of daily ritual would eventually press it into the background. The state did not consider this cruelty. It considered it efficiency. After all, Rome had a job for the Vestals to do. They were not there to feel connected. They were there to remain constant. In this way, the selection of Vestals reveals more about Rome than about the girls themselves. Rome did not trust adults to embody purity without distraction. Adults had histories, desires, loyalties. Children were blank enough to be reshaped. The ceremony framed the act as sacred. The language softened the reality, but beneath the incense and formal declarations was a simple truth. Rome took what it needed and thanked the gods for making it feel justified. The Vestal Virgin began her service not with devotion but with displacement. Her life did not unfold naturally into duty. It was redirected abruptly and permanently. And this was only the beginning. The city expected her to grow into the role without resentment, to accept responsibility without complaint, to become calm enough that her own loss would never be visible. Rome demanded this composure because it needed to believe that its system worked. That order could be engineered. That stability could be produced by careful selection and firm control. The girl's silence was the first proof. And so, before she ever learned a ritual, before she touched the sacred flame, before she understood the weight placed upon her, the Vestal Virgin learned the most important lesson of all. Rome did not ask. Rome chose. Luxury without exit. From the outside, the house of the Vestals looked like a reward. Marble walls caught the light, columns stood straight and calm, fountains whispered steadily into shallow pools. It sat beside the Roman Forum, the loud heart of the city, yet appeared untouched by its chaos. To Roman eyes, this was proof of favor. The Vestals lived better than most senators, better than generals, better than nearly every woman in Rome. And that was exactly the point. Rome liked its symbols to be impressive. If the Vestals represented stability, they needed to look stable. If they embodied divine approval, they needed to appear untouched by ordinary discomfort. The house of the Vestals was not merely a residence. It was an argument made of stone. Inside, the building offered everything that could be praised without inviting freedom. Spacious rooms, clean water, well-prepared food, servants to manage daily needs, gardens designed for quiet walking, shade in summer, warmth in winter. Rome did not neglect its most important reassurance device. But Rome also did not unlock the door. The Vestals lived in comfort, but comfort was carefully contained. Their world extended inward, not outward. Corridors looped back into courtyards. Windows looked onto controlled spaces. The city itself lay just beyond reach, audible but distant, like a conversation happening in the next room that you were never invited to join. This arrangement suited Rome's logic. The Vestals needed to be visible but not accessible, present but not engaged, close to power but never part of it. They existed at the center of Rome without participating in its motion. Freedom, after all, introduces variables. The Vestals could walk within their residence, they could tend gardens, they could speak with one another, they could move freely from room to room. Rome called this independence, and technically it was. But independence bounded by walls behaves differently. It becomes routine, predictable, safe. Leaving the compound required permission, not because the Vestals were untrustworthy, but because the city was. Rome feared what proximity might imply, what rumors might form, what accidental interactions could be misinterpreted. The Vestals' reputation needed protection, and protection often looks a lot like confinement. Privacy did not exist in the modern sense. The Vestals were rarely alone. Servants passed through rooms quietly. Senior priestesses observed novices constantly. Ritual schedules filled the day. Silence itself became a shared space, carefully maintained. Every movement mattered. Rome believed symbols worked best when they did not surprise anyone. A Vestal was expected to appear composed at all times, not joyful, not sorrowful, calm, measured, unremarkable in emotion. A perfectly tuned instrument left permanently on display. This expectation extended into the smallest details. How a Vestal walked through a corridor, how long she paused at a doorway, how she held her hands. None of this was written down explicitly. Rome preferred unspoken rules. They created self-correction. If a Vestal lingered too long by a window, someone noticed. If she laughed too freely, someone remembered. If she appeared tired, the city quietly wondered whether the gods were displeased. And so the Vestals learned restraint as a form of survival. The irony was that compared to other Roman women, they were extraordinarily privileged. Most women lived under constant male authority. They required permission to travel, to manage property, to make legal decisions. Vestals, by contrast, had legal independence. They could own wealth. They could act without guardians. In public, they commanded respect. But this independence came with a condition Rome rarely acknowledged. It functioned only within a carefully designed enclosure. Freedom existed, but only in directions that led back inward. The House of the Vestals functioned much like a sanctuary and much like a showcase. Visitors could see its elegance. Politicians could point to it as evidence of Rome's moral order. The building reassured the public that something pure and stable still existed amid political noise. What the public did not see was the sameness of days. Life inside the house followed ritual rhythm. Wake, clean, prepare, observe, repeat. Meals were taken at prescribed times. Activities unfolded according to schedule. Even rest had structure. The body learned obedience through repetition long before the mind questioned it. This routine was not cruel. It did not need to be. It was effective. Over time, the Vestals learned to exist without expecting surprise, without expecting change, without expecting choice. The house trained them gently but thoroughly. You did not need bars when habit did the work for you. Rome understood this well. The location of the house reinforced the lesson. Positioned beside the forum, the Vestals were always close to noise, debate, ambition, and conflict. They could hear crowds gathering. They could sense political tension. They could smell smoke from sacrifices and celebrations alike. Yet they remained separate. This proximity without participation served Rome perfectly. The Vestals absorbed the city's stress without contributing to it. They remained calm while everything else fluctuated. Their stillness functioned as reassurance. If they were steady, the city felt steadier too. Even leisure was regulated. Gardens were for walking, not wandering. Conversations were polite, not exploratory. Curiosity about the outside world was not forbidden, but it was discouraged through omission. There was always something to attend to, always a ritual to prepare for, always an expectation to meet. Over time, the absence of alternatives became normal. This was the true luxury Rome offered the Vestals. Not wealth, not comfort, predictability. In a society built on conquest and competition, predictability was rare. The Vestals lived lives without sudden upheaval, provided they followed the rules perfectly. Of course, perfection was the expectation. The house did not feel like a prison. That was its brilliance. It felt like safety, like order, like importance. The Vestals were constantly reminded, subtly and overtly, that they lived this way because they mattered. And they did. But mattering in Rome often meant being watched. The House of the Vestals stood as a beautiful contradiction, a place where everything necessary was provided, except the one thing Rome could never allow its symbols to have: the option to walk away. And so the Vestals learned to inhabit a space where comfort replaced freedom and routine replaced choice. They learned to exist within walls that were not meant to punish, but to preserve. Rome did not cage its Vestals out of cruelty. It did so out of fear. Fear that without constant supervision, without constant structure, even the most carefully selected symbol might behave like a human being. And Rome had never trusted those. The fire that was never allowed to rest. Of all the responsibilities placed upon the Vestal Virgins, none carried more symbolic weight than the simplest one. Keep the fire burning, not brilliantly, not dramatically, just continuously, day after day, night after night, without interruption, without excuse. The sacred flame of Vesta did not roar, it did not perform, it did not impress visitors with sparks or heat. It burned quietly, steadily, like a promise Rome had made to itself and was terrified of breaking. This fire was not about warmth or light, it was about reassurance. As long as it lived, Rome believed it would too. In a city obsessed with control, the flame became the ultimate test. Rome conquered provinces, raised armies, rewrote laws, and rebuilt itself after disasters. But none of that mattered if the fire went out. A dead flame suggested something far worse than military defeat. It implied cosmic disapproval, the idea that the universe had finally lost patience. Naturally, Rome did not leave this task to chance. The Vestals tended the flame in shifts, rotating responsibility with careful precision. The fire was cleaned, fed, and monitored according to ritual instruction refined over generations. Every movement mattered. Which wood was used, how it was placed, when ashes were cleared. Nothing was casual, nothing was improvised. Rome did not trust improvisation around existential symbols. To an outsider, the job might have looked manageable. Fires need fuel, fires need attention. But this was not an ordinary hearth. This was Rome's emotional support flame, and emotional support objects are famously fragile. The Vestals understood this early. They were trained not simply to maintain fire, but to maintain composure while doing so. Panic was dangerous, distraction was dangerous, fatigue was dangerous. A Vestal tending the flame could not afford even a brief lapse in awareness. If the flame flickered too low, the city noticed. If smoke behaved strangely, people whispered. If the fire went out entirely, the city did not ask how. It asked who. Rome loved assigning responsibility. If the flame extinguished, the Vestal on duty was punished. Rome insisted these punishments were mild, corrective, instructional. Rome said many things. What mattered was the message delivered to the public. Order had been restored. Someone had been held accountable. The universe had been appeased. The irony, of course, was that fire is stubbornly indifferent to symbolism. Wind exists, weather exists, human bodies tire, but Rome preferred explanations that preserved its sense of control. Admitting that chance played a role would mean admitting vulnerability. And Rome did not do vulnerability, so the Vestals learned to treat the flame as something alive, but unforgiving. It did not care how young they were. It did not care how long they had been awake. It did not care whether their hands trembled slightly from exhaustion. The flame demanded steadiness, and Rome demanded the appearance of perfection. This created a peculiar pressure. The Vestals were not merely keeping something alive. They were preventing everyone else from panicking. Their success was invisible. Their failure would be unforgettable. A Vestal who performed her duty perfectly earned silence. No praise, no celebration, just the quiet continuation of everything else. That was success. The city woke up, markets opened, senators argued, armies marched. The world continued, blissfully unaware of how close it had come to cosmic embarrassment. Failure, on the other hand, was loud. If the flame went out, Rome reacted instantly. Rituals were performed, purifications ordered, animals sacrificed, priests chanted, officials whispered about omens, citizens looked for patterns. Someone had to explain why the universe had blinked, and the explanation almost never blamed the universe. The Vestal responsible would be disciplined in private but discussed publicly. Rome liked discretion for itself, not for its symbols. The event became a reminder that stability was fragile and required constant vigilance. This suited Rome's worldview perfectly. Anxiety justified control. Control reassured anxiety. The Vestals lived inside this loop. Over time, they developed an almost intimate relationship with the flame. They learned its moods, how it responded to certain materials, how it behaved in different seasons. They could sense when it needed attention before it visibly showed signs of decline. This skill was not mystical. It was earned through repetition and fear. The flame was always present. Even when they slept, its existence hovered at the edge of awareness. Someone else might be on duty, but responsibility never fully left the mind. The idea that something so small could carry so much weight settled deeply into their thinking. Rome considered this devotion admirable. What Rome did not consider was the cost of asking human beings to function as infrastructure. The flame also played a role in public life. It was referenced during ceremonies, invoked during crises. Its continued existence was cited as proof that Rome was still favored, still ordered, still destined to endure. Politicians spoke of it with reverence, despite never having stood watch beside it at dawn. This distance was convenient. The Vestals became associated with the flame so completely that they faded behind it. Their individual identities mattered less than their collective function. Rome did not need to know who they were. It needed to know the fire was still there. And yet the Vestals were human. They felt time pass. They felt fatigue. They noticed seasons change. They aged alongside the flame year by year, quietly growing more skilled and more careful. There is a subtle cruelty in assigning eternity to a task that must be repeated daily. Rome demanded constancy from people whose lives moved forward regardless. The flame never aged. The Vestals did. This imbalance shaped their existence. They learned patience beyond what most people were asked to cultivate. They learned to accept repetition without boredom, vigilance without recognition, responsibility without relief. Rome praised this as virtue. The flame was also used as a teaching tool. Younger Vestals were instructed not only in how to maintain it, but in how to think about it. The fire was framed as something that depended entirely on their discipline. This reinforced the lesson that they were essential, and also that they were replaceable. If one failed, another would take her place. The flame did not care who tended it. Rome did not care either, as long as it burned. This is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the sacred fire. It revealed Rome's priorities with unsettling clarity. The symbol mattered. The system mattered. The individuals existed to serve continuity, not to experience it. And yet, the Vestals did their job. For centuries, through wars, coups, political purges, and shifting borders, the flame remained. Not because Rome was always stable, but because the Vestals were not allowed to be anything else. Eventually, the world changed. Rome stopped believing in the flame, or at least it stopped funding the belief. When the Temple of Vesta closed, the fire was extinguished deliberately, not as a punishment, not as a failure, as a decision. Nothing immediate happened. The city did not collapse. The streets did not crack open. Life went on, slightly quieter, slightly less certain, but intact. The realization came slowly. The flame had never been holding the world together. The Vestals had. They had absorbed the fear, managed the symbolism, maintained the illusion that control was possible if someone was watching closely enough. When the flame finally rested, it revealed what it had always been. Not a source of power, a mirror, and what it reflected was a civilization deeply uncomfortable with uncertainty, willing to place its peace of mind in the hands of a few, so long as those hands never shook. 30 years measured in silence. Rome did not believe important roles should be rushed. It also did not believe they should be gentle. So when it designed the life of a Vestal Virgin, it settled on a number that felt reassuringly complete. 30 years. Long enough to reshape a person. Long enough to drain uncertainty. long enough for obedience to feel natural. The service was divided neatly into 3 decades of purpose. Rome loved structure. Structure suggested control. And control, in Roman thinking, was always one careful schedule away. The first 10 years were for learning. The second 10 years were for doing. The final 10 years were for watching others do it correctly. This arrangement looked orderly. It also ensured that, by the time a Vestal was free to leave, she barely remembered what leaving meant. The apprenticeship began immediately. A young Vestal entered the temple not to explore, but to absorb. She learned ritual first, not meaning. Rome did not consider meaning essential at the beginning. Precision came first. Understanding, if it arrived at all, could wait. Every gesture was taught deliberately. How to walk, how to stand, how to speak when speaking was required, and how to remain silent when it was not. Silence, in fact, was one of the earliest skills mastered. Silence reduced mistakes. Silence reduced interpretation. Silence was safe. The apprentice Vestal learned the calendar of rituals, a schedule dense with repetition and nuance. Certain actions had to be performed on exact days, at exact hours, in exact ways. Deviations were not creative, they were dangerous. Rome was deeply uncomfortable with improvisation near anything sacred. Writing and record-keeping were also taught, but not for self-expression. Writing preserved continuity. It ensured the future would resemble the past closely enough to feel familiar. A Vestal learned how to copy, how to preserve, and how not to add unnecessary commentary. Rome preferred clean transmission over reflection. Mistakes during these early years were corrected quietly. Correction was constant, but rarely dramatic. A raised eyebrow, a repeated instruction, a subtle pause in conversation. Rome favored methods that trained the Vestal to correct herself before anyone else had to. This created a particular kind of attentiveness. The apprentice learned to monitor her own thoughts, her posture, her pace. She became skilled at noticing what she might do wrong before doing it. Rome considered this discipline. It also happened to be exhausting. After 10 years, the Vestal entered her period of active service. This was the decade Rome cared about most. She was now fully responsible. The sacred flame depended on her vigilance. National rituals passed through her hands. Sacred objects were entrusted to her care. The Vestal by this stage moved with confidence, or something resembling it. Her actions were smooth, practiced, almost automatic. This was not because the work had become easy. It was because there was no longer room for hesitation. Rome rewarded this competence with visibility. The Vestal took part in public ceremonies. She stood as proof that the system worked. Citizens watched her movements, not closely enough to understand, but closely enough to feel reassured. Behind this calm exterior, the responsibility remained heavy. The Vestal understood the stakes. If the flame went out, the city would panic. If a ritual was performed incorrectly, someone would notice. If something went wrong elsewhere, people would look in her direction, just briefly, just to check. Success during this decade was defined by absence. Nothing happened. The city continued. That was the goal. Rome did not celebrate this success. It assumed it. The second decade also brought authority. Younger Vestals deferred to her. Servants listened carefully. Instructions carried weight. This authority was real, but it was narrow. It applied only within the system. Outside it, the Vestal remained separate, admired but distant, respected but constrained. Power in Rome often worked this way. It looked impressive from afar and felt very specific from inside. By the third decade, the Vestal's role shifted again. She no longer tended the flame as often. She no longer stood at the center of ritual attention. Instead, she watched, she corrected, she remembered. This was the decade of supervision. The Vestal became an institutional memory. She carried details no one else questioned anymore. Why this gesture mattered? Why that phrase could not be altered? Why the timing of a ritual could not drift, even slightly? Rome depended heavily on this memory. Written records existed, but Rome trusted lived repetition more. The senior Vestals embodied continuity in a way parchment never could. This role required patience. Younger Vestals made mistakes. They asked questions. They hesitated. The senior Vestal responded not with sympathy, but with precision. Sympathy could soften rules. Precision preserved them. There was irony here. After decades of discipline, the Vestal was now responsible for shaping others exactly as she had been shaped. The system sustained itself through quiet replication. Rome admired this efficiency. The final years passed slowly. The Vestal watched seasons repeat. She saw girls arrive who reminded her vaguely of someone she might once have been. She instructed them carefully without sharing too much of herself. Personal reflection was unnecessary. The role mattered more than the individual experience. And then, finally, the 30 years ended. Rome technically allowed Vestals to leave after their service concluded. They could marry, they could return to private life. Rome even framed this as a reward, proof that the system did not consume people entirely. In practice, many Vestals chose not to leave, or perhaps found leaving difficult to imagine. After 30 years of routine, supervision, and symbolic importance, ordinary life felt strangely unstructured. Freedom without instruction can be disorienting. Those who did leave carried their discipline with them. Their movements remained measured. Their speech remained careful. The system had done its work. Rome never reflected publicly on what it meant to ask 30 years of absolute precision from a human life. It did not consider whether such structure came at a cost. Rome measured success differently. The system endured. That was enough. The 3 stages of service were not designed to nurture individuals. They were designed to produce consistency. Apprentices learned not to fail. Practitioners learned not to hesitate. Supervisors learned not to forget. Together, they created something Rome valued deeply: predictability. And in a civilization built on conquest, uncertainty, and ambition, predictability was the closest thing Rome had to peace. The Vestal Virgins gave it 30 years of their lives. Rome never asked whether that was too much. Privilege carefully contained. Rome was not generous with freedom, especially not to women. Most Roman women lived lives shaped by guardianship, expectation, and quiet limitation. Their movements were monitored, their property managed by others, their public presence carefully minimized. Rome believed order required hierarchy, and hierarchy required supervision. And then there were the Vestal Virgins. On paper, they were astonishingly free. A Vestal could own property in her own name. She could manage wealth, sign contracts, and write a will without consulting a male guardian. She could walk through the city unescorted, a privilege so rare that it bordered on unsettling. In public events, she was given a seat of honor, often closer to power than senators who technically ruled the state. If a vestal passed a condemned prisoner on the way to execution and contact occurred, accidental, unplanned, unrequested, the sentence could be lifted. The law allowed it. Rome called this mercy. Rome also called it symbolism. To modern eyes, these privileges appear revolutionary. And within Rome's rigid structure, they were. The Vestals stood as proof that Rome could imagine women as autonomous beings under very specific conditions. Those conditions mattered more than the privileges themselves. Rome did not grant these freedoms because it trusted women. It granted them because it trusted symbols. The Vestals were not women first. They were institutions. Their bodies, voices, and movements carried meaning far beyond personal choice. Granting them legal autonomy did not threaten Rome's order. It reinforced it. The Vestal's ability to own property was not about independence. It was about continuity. Sacred objects needed caretakers who would not disappear with a father's death or a husband's ambition. Property, in a Vestal's name, stayed where Rome expected it to stay. Their freedom to sign contracts existed for similar reasons. Someone had to manage temple resources efficiently. Rome preferred efficiency that did not require negotiation with households, husbands, or heirs. The Vestal, legally independent, solved this problem neatly. Even the right to write a will carried a certain logic. Vestals needed to plan the future of sacred assets without interference. Their autonomy served administration, not self-determination. Walking without a male guardian, however, struck Romans as extraordinary. This privilege was less about convenience and more about visibility. The Vestal's unescorted presence reminded the public that she existed outside ordinary social rules. She was not available, not dependent, not approachable. This distance was intentional. The Vestal moved through the city like a living boundary marker, close enough to be seen, far enough to remain untouched. Her freedom did not invite imitation. It discouraged it. Ordinary women were not meant to wonder why they lacked these rights. They were meant to understand that the Vestal was not ordinary. Rome reinforced this distinction carefully. Public seating revealed it clearly. Vestals sat where others could not. Their proximity to power was symbolic, not participatory. They did not speak in debates. They did not vote. They were present to be seen, not to influence outcomes directly. Rome liked power that did not interrupt. The story of the condemned prisoner is often told with admiration. A Vestal crosses paths with a man on his way to death. The law pauses. Fate hesitates. Mercy is granted. It sounds humane, almost miraculous. In reality, this law served Rome's obsession with purity and omen. Executing someone who had just encountered a Vestal risked contamination. The mercy was less about compassion and more about cosmic caution. Rome was not sparing the prisoner. It was protecting itself. The Vestal's presence did not grant forgiveness. It postponed danger. This distinction mattered, though Rome rarely acknowledged it openly. The irony of these privileges becomes clearer when viewed alongside their limitations. Vestals were legally independent but socially enclosed. They could manage property but could not choose partners. They could walk freely, but only within an invisible perimeter of expectation. They were honored publicly, but monitored constantly. Freedom in their case was narrow and conditional. Rome liked its contradictions elegant. The Vestals were trusted because they were controlled. Their autonomy existed because their lives were predictable. Rome could afford to loosen certain legal restrictions precisely because it tightened every other aspect of their existence. This balance reassured the city. It could point to the Vestals as evidence of progress without risking disruption. Women could have rights, Rome implied, as long as those rights did not produce unpredictability. The Vestals understood this arrangement instinctively. They did not test boundaries. Testing boundaries would suggest individuality, and individuality complicated symbolism. The Vestal learned to use her privileges quietly without drawing attention to them. Possessing power without exercising it openly became a skill. Their legal autonomy also carried an emotional weight. Vestals stood outside traditional family structures. They were daughters of Rome, not of households. This isolation gave them authority but removed intimacy. They belonged everywhere and nowhere at once. Rome celebrated this detachment. It viewed emotional distance as stability. Personal attachment created divided loyalties. The Vestals' separation ensured singular devotion to the city, the flame, the idea of continuity. The privileges reinforced this separation. Ordinary women lived lives woven into family networks. Vestals lived parallel to society, legally present but socially distinct. Their autonomy did not bring connection. It reinforced solitude. This solitude was framed as honor. Over time, the Vestals became symbols of what Rome admired but did not practice widely: restraint, order, detachment. Their privileges elevated them while simultaneously preventing them from belonging fully anywhere else. Rome often treats its symbols this way. It places them above ordinary life and then ensures they can never return to it. When Vestals completed their service, some chose to leave and marry. Rome allowed this and praised it as generosity. But the transition was rarely simple. After decades of structured autonomy, ordinary dependence felt strange. Freedom, when it arrives without instruction, can feel less like opportunity and more like exposure. Many Vestals remained within religious life instead, not because they lacked options, but because the world beyond symbolic privilege was less predictable. Rome never questioned whether these privileges compensated for what was taken. It did not measure cost in emotional terms. It measured success in continuity. The Vestal Virgins stand as one of Rome's most revealing paradoxes. They were among the freest women in the city and among the least free to define themselves. Their rights existed within a system designed to use them as reassurance. They could own property, but not their future. They could walk freely, but not wander. They could grant mercy, but not choose their lives. Rome called this balance. And for a civilization deeply uncomfortable with uncertainty, it was the most comfortable arrangement imaginable. The cost of being untouched. Rome loved the idea of purity. It spoke of it reverently, as if it were something fragile and precious, easily broken by careless hands. In practice, Rome treated purity as a tool, useful, symbolic, and entirely replaceable when convenient. No one learned this more clearly than the Vestal Virgins. Their most famous requirement was also their most misunderstood. For 30 years, a Vestal was expected to remain absolutely chaste. Not symbolically, not ideally, absolutely. The rule was rigid, public, and enforced with a seriousness that suggested the fate of the world itself depended on it. Rome insisted this was necessary. The logic was simple and deeply unsettling. The Vestal's body was believed to mirror the state of the city. If she remained untouched, Rome remained protected. If she did not, something somewhere would go wrong. Crops would fail, armies would stumble, storms would arrive uninvited. The connection was never clearly explained, but explanation was unnecessary. Fear filled in the gaps. This belief transformed private existence into public infrastructure. A Vestal's chastity was no longer personal. It became communal property, something the city felt entitled to monitor, discuss, and defend. Rome did not trust invisible virtue. It trusted rules, surveillance, and punishment. The Vestals were not expected to desire. Desire complicated systems. Desire introduced unpredictability. Rome preferred women who did not want anything that could not be scheduled. This expectation began early. From the moment of selection, the Vestal was taught that her body was no longer hers to interpret. It was something to maintain, much like the sacred flame. Attention without attachment. Presence without participation. Rome framed this as honor. The Vestal was elevated above ordinary concerns. She was freed from marriage, pregnancy, domestic obligation. This sounded generous. It was also strategic. Marriage created alliances. Alliances created loyalties. Loyalties divided attention. Rome wanted none of that. Chastity simplified everything. A Vestal without family ties could belong entirely to the state. Her emotional energy was redirected toward ritual, routine, and restraint. Rome did not suppress desire because it was immoral. It suppressed it because it was inconvenient. Of course, suppressing desire does not remove it. It simply drives it underground, where Rome preferred not to look. The real danger was not violation. It was suspicion. Rome was a society deeply uncomfortable with uncertainty. When things went wrong, and things always went wrong eventually, people searched for causes. Military losses, strange weather, political unrest, unexplained illness. None of these could be allowed to feel random. Someone had to be responsible. The Vestals were ideal candidates. They were visible, they were symbolic, they were already associated with purity and cosmic order, and they were few enough to monitor closely. Accusation did not require proof so much as atmosphere. A bad year created bad questions. Bad questions looked for convenient answers. Suspicion alone could be enough. A Vestal did not need to be caught. She only needed to be believed capable. Rumor carried weight. A lingering glance, a perceived change in behavior, a city already anxious would connect dots, whether or not the dots belonged together. Rome called this vigilance. The cruelty of the system lay in its imbalance. Chastity was demanded as a guarantee of safety, yet safety was never guaranteed in return. The Vestal bore responsibility without protection. If Rome prospered, her success was invisible. If Rome suffered, her failure was assumed. Purity functioned less like a moral standard and more like a sacrificial buffer. The Vestals understood this even if Rome pretended not to. They learned to manage appearances carefully, neutral expressions, measured movements, distance from others. Innocence was not enough. Innocence had to look convincing. This constant self-monitoring shaped their inner lives. Thought itself became something to supervise. Emotion became suspicious. Attachment became dangerous. Even kindness required caution. Rome had little patience for ambiguity. Ironically, this obsession with purity revealed Rome's insecurity more than its virtue. A confident society does not require symbolic bodies to absorb its fear. An anxious one does. The punishment for violation was severe, but the fear of accusation was worse. Punishment ended things. Accusation suspended them. A Vestal under suspicion lived in uncertainty, watched more closely, spoken about more carefully, evaluated without rest. Rome excelled at this kind of pressure. It rarely needed to act decisively. The threat of action was enough, and yet Rome insisted the system was just. It claimed that Vestals were honored, protected, elevated, and in certain ways they were. But elevation is not the same as safety. Being placed above ordinary life often means falling farther when the balance shifts. The chastity rule also served a quieter function. It reassured men that the Vestals were unavailable, not merely uninterested, but structurally inaccessible. This removed a source of tension Rome preferred not to manage. Desire could destabilize hierarchy. Chastity preserved it. The humor, if it can be called that, lies in Rome's confidence that suppressing desire eliminated risk. History suggests otherwise. Desire does not disappear, it adapts, it waits, it finds expression in subtler ways. Rome simply chose not to record those complexities. Instead, it recorded violations. These stories were preserved as warnings, evidence that the system worked, proof that purity mattered. Rare enough to feel shocking, public enough to feel instructive. Rome was very good at using individual suffering to reinforce collective belief. The Vestal, in these moments, ceased to be a person entirely. She became a lesson. What Rome never examined was the emotional cost of asking someone to represent perfection for 3 decades. The strain of living under constant moral surveillance, the quiet erosion of trust in one's own impulses, the narrowing of inner life to fit external expectation. Rome did not measure that cost. It measured outcomes. As long as the city stood, the system was justified. In the end, the chastity of the Vestal Virgins tells us less about sexual morality and more about fear management. Rome needed a place to store its anxiety. It chose a small group of women and called the arrangement sacred. The Vestals paid the price in vigilance, restraint, and silence. Rome paid nothing at all. And when the system finally ended, it was not because it was cruel or unjust or unsustainable. It ended because Rome found other ways to explain disaster. The Vestals were no longer needed as offerings. Their purity had served its purpose. A punishment designed to look clean. Rome disliked messy endings, especially when the ending involved something it had already labeled sacred. Killing a Vestal Virgin outright would have felt crude, almost careless, as if the city were admitting that its symbols could be destroyed with ordinary violence. Rome preferred solutions that preserved appearances. So, when a Vestal was judged to have broken her vow, the city chose a punishment that allowed it to claim innocence while ensuring removal. The Vestal was not executed. She was contained. The method was simple, formal, and carefully worded. The Vestal would be led outside the city to a prepared underground chamber. Inside, there would be a small amount of food, a lamp, and sometimes a bed. The chamber would then be sealed. Rome would walk away. This mattered enormously to Roman conscience. The city had not spilled sacred blood. It had not laid hands on a holy body. It had merely created a space and allowed fate to complete the process. Responsibility, like the Vestal herself, disappeared underground. Rome considered this elegant. The language used around the punishment was calm, almost administrative. There was no public spectacle for the Vestal, no shouting crowd, no dramatic display. This was not entertainment. It was sanitation. The city was cleaning up a problem without acknowledging what the problem had cost. The irony was deliberate. Rome wanted the punishment to feel inevitable, not vengeful, as if the Vestal were being returned to the earth quietly, without accusation, without anger. The tone suggested regret. The structure suggested relief. The man involved, if there was one, did not receive such courtesy. He was executed publicly, swiftly, visibly. Rome had no issue spilling his blood. He was not sacred. He was not symbolic in the same way. His death served a different purpose. It reassured the public that rules were enforced, that boundaries mattered, that violations carried consequences. The contrast was striking. The Vestal vanished. The man became a warning. This difference was not accidental. Rome needed to preserve the illusion that it respected holiness even while destroying the person who embodied it. The Vestal could not be seen to suffer openly. That might suggest the gods were being offended. So her suffering was hidden, sealed, behind stone and ritual language. Rome had perfected this technique across many areas of governance. Pain was acceptable as long as it did not disrupt the story. The procession to the burial site followed strict rules. Silence was enforced. The Vestal walked without resistance. Resistance would have suggested agency, and Rome preferred submission. The calmness of the event reassured everyone involved that order was being restored. Observers often described the atmosphere as solemn rather than cruel. Rome excelled at turning cruelty into ceremony. The underground chamber itself was small and deliberately inadequate. It contained just enough to avoid the charge of direct killing. Food for a short time, light for a while, the possibility of survival that would not last. Rome enjoyed technical innocence. Once sealed, the chamber was left alone. There were no guards, no checks, no record of what happened next. Rome did not need details. The outcome was understood. The Vestal was removed. The symbol was preserved. The city moved on. This punishment revealed Rome's discomfort with responsibility. The city needed to punish, but it did not want to acknowledge its role as executioner. By stepping back, Rome could claim that the gods, or fate, or necessity had taken over. It was a sophisticated form of denial. The Vestal, meanwhile, had no voice in the process. She was not asked for confession in the modern sense. Guilt was assumed through verdict. Once declared, there was no reversal. The system did not concern itself with doubt. Doubt weakened authority. The cruelty of the punishment lay not only in its outcome, but in its logic. The Vestal was punished for violating purity, yet the punishment itself destroyed her body in the most complete way possible. Rome reconciled this contradiction by pretending it had not acted at all. There is a grim humor here if one looks closely. A civilization that prided itself on law and reason constructed a punishment that relied entirely on pretense. Rome did not kill. Rome simply arranged circumstances. The man's execution, by contrast, satisfied Rome's appetite for clarity. He was guilty. He died. The story ended cleanly. His death reassured the public that transgression had been addressed decisively. The Vestal's fate reassured the gods that ritual propriety had been respected. Each punishment served a different audience. What made this system especially unsettling was its calmness. There was no rage, no moral panic in tone. Everything unfolded with bureaucratic precision. Rome did not need to shout to feel powerful. It had learned that quiet authority was more convincing. The Vestal's burial became part of Rome's cultural memory. Not often discussed, but never forgotten, it hovered at the edge of awareness, reminding every Vestal what failure looked like. Fear in Rome was most effective when it did not need frequent reinforcement. Most Vestals never experienced this fate. That was the point. The rarity made it more effective. The system did not require mass suffering. It required just enough to keep everyone careful. Rome used individual lives to stabilize collective anxiety. From a distance, the punishment appears barbaric. From within Rome's logic, it was necessary. Rome believed itself to be acting responsibly, even compassionately. It had avoided bloodshed. It had followed tradition. It had preserved cosmic order. That belief mattered more than reality. The Vestal's burial also served another purpose. It removed a symbol that had failed. Rome could not allow a visibly impure Vestal to exist. That would undermine the entire structure. Better to erase the symbol entirely and continue as if nothing had happened. And so the city resumed its routines. Markets reopened, debates continued, the sacred flame burned on, tended by others. Rome demonstrated its favorite lesson. The system outlasts the individual. The Vestal Virgin, once central to Rome's sense of safety, became a footnote, a cautionary tale, an uncomfortable memory rarely examined too closely. Rome never questioned whether such punishments reflected strength or fear. It did not need to. The city survived, and survival justified everything. In the end, the most unsettling aspect of the punishment is not its brutality, but its restraint. The careful language, the quiet procession, the clean hands. Rome did not scream when it destroyed its symbols. It whispered, and then it went back to sleep. Useful innocence. Vestals as political tools. Rome liked to imagine itself as rational. It built roads in straight lines, counted votes carefully, and wrote laws so detailed they could suffocate a room. But beneath that orderly surface lived a constant unease. Famine might come, armies might fail. The gods might be irritated by something as minor as a poorly phrased prayer. When that anxiety grew too loud, Rome did what many societies do best. It looked for someone quiet to blame. The Vestal Virgins were ideal for this role. They stood at the center of Rome's emotional life while remaining almost entirely silent. They represented stability, purity, and divine favor, but they held no armies, commanded no factions, and cast no votes. They were visible enough to absorb fear, but powerless enough not to resist it. That combination made them extremely useful. In times of crisis, Rome did not panic openly. It redirected panic. A bad harvest, an eclipse, a military embarrassment that senators would rather not explain. These were not policy failures, these were omens, and omens needed interpretation. Conveniently, the Vestals existed precisely to carry symbolic meaning. When Rome felt uneasy, it examined them closely. A Vestal's stumble in public could become a sign of cosmic imbalance. A cough during a ritual might provoke whispers. A flame flickering at the wrong moment could trigger a citywide tightening of nerves. None of this required evidence. Rome did not need proof. It needed reassurance that someone was responsible. Blame is soothing when it has a face. Politicians understood this instinct well. Accusing a Vestal of impropriety was not merely a religious act. It was a political maneuver. It allowed leaders to redirect attention away from economic strain, military overreach, or internal dissent. The narrative was simple. The city had suffered because someone sacred had failed. Rome loved simple narratives. Once suspicion took hold, logic quickly lost relevance. Vestals were not judged by actions alone, but by atmosphere. If the year felt unlucky, someone had to be at fault. Vestals were already living under intense symbolic pressure, which meant they required very little additional suspicion to tip into guilt. The city treated this as natural. This process served a psychological purpose. Collective anxiety is uncomfortable when it has no outlet. Vestals provided a pressure valve. By focusing fear onto a small, controlled group, Rome could feel proactive rather than helpless. Punishing a Vestal did not fix droughts or defeat enemies, but it felt like action. There is a subtle cruelty in how calmly this system functioned. No one needed to shout accusations. Rumors spread softly, carried by implication rather than declaration. A senator might remark that the signs have been troubling lately. A priest might suggest that discipline has weakened. The audience filled in the rest. Rome excelled at implication. What made the Vestals particularly vulnerable was their contradictory position. They were exalted as moral ideals, yet stripped of personal identity. They were revered, but not defended. They embodied perfection in theory, which meant any perceived imperfection felt catastrophic. The higher the pedestal, the shorter the fall. This dynamic also reinforced social hierarchy. Ordinary Romans could look at Vestals and feel both admiration and relief. Admiration because the Vestals lived privileged lives. Relief because when disaster struck, it would not be them standing trial. Scapegoating is most effective when it feels selective. The Vestal's silence further strengthened their usefulness. They were trained to maintain composure, not argue. Public protest would have undermined their sacred image. Defense would have sounded like guilt. So they endured suspicion quietly, which Rome interpreted as dignity or confirmation. Political rivals sometimes used Vestal accusations as weapons. Associating an enemy with sacrilege was far more effective than accusing them of corruption. Corruption was expected. Offending the gods was alarming. An opponent linked to a Vestal scandal became radioactive overnight. Rome's political culture thrived on theater. This manipulation extended beyond individuals to entire periods of instability. During wars, plagues, or transitions of power, Vestals were scrutinized intensely. The city needed assurance that the universe still approved of Rome's existence. When confidence wavered, suspicion followed. The Vestals became emotional infrastructure, invisible when things went well, essential when things went wrong. There is a faint, bitter humor in this arrangement. Rome trusted Vestals to uphold cosmic order, yet denied them any meaningful control over events. They were responsible without authority, revered without protection. A familiar arrangement. Even when Vestals were proven innocent, the damage often lingered. Public doubt does not disappear easily. Once suspicion enters collective imagination, it reshapes memory. The Vestal might return to duty, but the city never quite forgot that it had once considered her expendable. Rome remembered its fears more clearly than its facts. This system reveals how power often operates under the guise of reverence. By elevating the Vestals, Rome ensured they would absorb its anxieties. By isolating them, Rome ensured they could not redirect blame outward. They were buffers between chaos and control. From a modern perspective, the injustice is obvious. From Rome's perspective, the arrangement was efficient. The city remained stable. The institutions endured. Individual suffering was regrettable, but acceptable. Rome measured success collectively. In this way, the Vestals were not merely priestesses, they were emotional shock absorbers. They transformed fear into ritual, guilt into ceremony, and uncertainty into manageable narratives. Rome did not need them to act. It needed them to exist. And when that existence became inconvenient, Rome had mechanisms ready. Quiet ones, respectable ones, ones that allowed the city to feel calm again. The unsettling truth is not that Rome used the Vestals politically. It is how naturally the system accepted that use. No outrage followed, no reckoning occurred. The logic felt self-evident. Societies, ancient or modern, rarely question the tools that soothed them. The Vestal Virgins carried Rome's peace on their shoulders, and Rome repaid them with suspicion whenever peace felt fragile. It was not personal, it was practical. And Rome was very good at being practical in ways that kept it awake at night, while convincing itself it could sleep soundly. When the fire was no longer needed. By the late 4th century CE, Rome had grown tired of its own reflection. The city still stood, the roads still stretched across continents, the forums still echoed with footsteps and arguments. But the story Rome told itself about why it existed had changed. Slowly at first, quietly, then all at once. The Vestal order did not collapse in scandal. It was not discredited by failure, corruption, or divine catastrophe. The sacred flame did not flicker out in panic. No omen announced its weakness. It was simply turned off. This detail matters. When Emperor Theodosius I issued decrees in the 380s and 390s that dismantled Rome's traditional religious institutions, The Vestals were included not because they had failed, but because they no longer fit. Christianity had become the empire's official faith, and with it came a different understanding of order, authority, and salvation. Rome no longer needed a fire to reassure itself. For nearly 1,000 years, the Vestal flame had functioned as the city's emotional center. As long as it burned, Rome believed itself intact. The flame was not about heat or light. It was about continuity, about the idea that the city's heart was still beating, even when politics faltered or armies failed. Christian Rome replaced that symbolism with something else. Not a flame, but a doctrine. Not a ritual, but a belief system that promised order without constant maintenance. The new faith offered stability that did not depend on 6 women performing perfection in public. This was efficient. The Vestal order ended not with resistance, but with administrative finality. Funding stopped. Rituals ceased. The house of the Vestals emptied gradually like a building whose purpose had expired. The flame, once guarded with obsessive care, was extinguished without ceremony. No crowds gathered in terror. No disasters followed. That, more than anything, unsettled Rome's traditionalists. For centuries, Romans had been taught that the flame's survival equaled the city's survival. Its extinction should have triggered cosmic collapse. Instead, life continued. Crops grew, armies marched, bureaucracy functioned. The silence after the flame went dark was louder than any omen. This moment revealed something Rome had long avoided confronting. The Vestals had never been protecting the city from the gods. They had been protecting the city from itself, from anxiety, from uncertainty, from the fear that history might not be manageable. Once Rome adopted a faith that promised certainty beyond ritual, the Vestals became unnecessary. Their disappearance was polite. No persecution followed, no mass punishment. They were simply retired by history. Some Vestals were absorbed into aristocratic households, others faded into anonymity. A few likely struggled to adjust to a world that no longer watched them with ritualized intensity. Imagine spending 30 years as a symbol, only to become a person again overnight. The house of the Vestals, once immaculate and guarded, slipped into quiet neglect. Courtyards filled with debris, fountains dried, statues cracked. The building did not fall dramatically, it decayed patiently, like an idea waiting to be forgotten. Rome preserved the ruins. It always did. The end of the Vestal order was not framed as an act of destruction. It was framed as progress. The empire was modernizing its spiritual infrastructure. Old systems were being replaced. Rome congratulated itself for evolving, and in many ways it had. But something subtle was lost. The Vestals had embodied a paradox that Rome understood instinctively. Stability requires constant care. The flame needed tending. The rituals needed repetition. Order did not maintain itself. It had to be performed day after day without applause. Christian Rome preferred permanence without maintenance, a truth that did not require nightly vigilance, a salvation not dependent on posture, timing, or a gust of wind. This was comforting. It was also a shift in responsibility. Under the old system, when things went wrong, Rome blamed the Vestals. Under the new system, failure became more abstract. Sin replaced omen. Belief replaced ritual error. Accountability drifted upward toward doctrine rather than individuals. This made governance easier. The Vestals had served as a convenient emotional buffer. Their removal meant Rome needed new ways to process fear, new narratives, new scapegoats. History suggests Rome adapted quickly. It always did. There is a quiet irony in how gently the Vestal order ended. After centuries of discipline, surveillance, and symbolic burden, their conclusion lacked drama. No martyrdom, no last stand, just obsolescence. The flame did not fail. Rome outgrew it. And perhaps that is the most unsettling part. The Vestals were not undone by cruelty or chaos. They were undone by irrelevance. Their perfection no longer mattered in a system that no longer measured worth the same way. Rome changed its identity. The Vestals remained who they had always been. History rarely rewards consistency. In the end, the sacred flame's extinction marked not a spiritual crisis, but a psychological one. Rome learned it could survive without the rituals that once anchored it. That realization was liberating and dangerous. Because once a civilization learns it can discard its symbols without consequence, it becomes very confident about discarding other things too. The Vestal Virgins did not disappear because they were wrong. They disappeared because Rome decided to believe in something else. The fire went dark, and the city kept breathing, which perhaps was the most unsettling omen of all. Honored, empowered, and carefully sacrificed. The Vestal Virgins remain one of Rome's most revealing contradictions. They are often remembered as evidence that ancient Rome respected women in ways other societies did not. And in some narrow technical sense, this is true. Vestals owned property. They moved freely through the city. They spoke in court. They commanded respect from men who otherwise controlled every legal and social structure around them. Rome pointed to them proudly. But history becomes more interesting when we stop asking what privileges existed and begin asking why they were granted. The Vestals were not empowered because Rome trusted women. They were empowered because Rome feared instability. Their authority was not rooted in equality, but in utility. They mattered not as individuals, but as instruments designed to absorb collective anxiety. Rome elevated them carefully, like fragile supports, holding up a trembling structure. The city needed proof that the universe approved of its existence. The Vestals provided that proof by standing very still and doing everything correctly. Their value lay in reassurance. As long as they appeared calm, pure, and unbroken, Rome could believe itself safe. This is how reverence often works. It looks like admiration. It functions like containment. The Vestals show us how a society can praise women publicly while restricting them privately. Rome granted them exceptional rights, then surrounded those rights with surveillance, expectation, and fear. Freedom was allowed, but only inside narrow symbolic boundaries. You could walk anywhere, but you could never relax. You could speak, but never explain yourself. You could exist without male guardianship, but never without public interpretation. This arrangement suited Rome perfectly. The Vestals became living evidence that the system was fair, while also serving as proof that deviation would be punished. Their status reassured the public. Their vulnerability disciplined it. Rome called this balance. From a distance, the system appears progressive. On closer inspection, it is meticulous control wrapped in ceremonial language. The Vestals were allowed power precisely because that power could be withdrawn. Their exceptional position made them visible. Visibility made them manageable. And when fear spread through the city, as it often did, visibility became danger. The Vestals absorbed Rome's anxieties the way stone absorbs heat, quietly, completely, without protest. When crops failed or armies faltered, the city did not look inward. It looked toward its symbols, and symbols, by design, cannot defend themselves. This is where the irony sharpens. Rome entrusted women with its spiritual stability, then blamed them for cosmic disorder. It claimed to honor feminine purity, then destroyed it the moment it felt threatened. The Vestals were both essential and expendable, sacred and disposable. The contradiction was not accidental, it was structural. The Vestals remind us that empowerment offered by authority is rarely unconditional. It comes with expectations that cannot be negotiated. The moment reassurance fails, reverence turns into suspicion. Privilege becomes liability. Rome did not ask whether this was fair. It asked whether it worked. For centuries, it did. The Vestals also exposed the mechanics of superstition. Not belief in gods alone, but belief in control. Rome believed that order could be maintained through precise behavior. That chaos could be prevented by ritual perfection. That fear could be managed if someone else carried it. The Vestals carried it. They stood at the intersection of gender, power, and anxiety. They were proof that a society can elevate women symbolically while denying them safety, that it can grant authority while removing protection, that it can celebrate female virtue while demanding female sacrifice. This pattern is not unique to Rome. That may be the most unsettling lesson. The Vestal Virgins were not merely priestesses, they were emotional infrastructure. They allowed Rome to externalize fear, ritualize uncertainty, and maintain the illusion that stability was earned through obedience rather than chance. They were not asked to change the world. They were asked to hold it together. And when the world changed anyway, they were quietly removed. History often frames this as an ending. In truth, it is a demonstration. The Vestals show us how power behaves when it feels threatened, how honor can coexist with cruelty, how reverence can become a tool. Rome did not invent these dynamics. It refined them. The Vestal Virgins stand as a reminder that when a society claims to honor women while asking them to absorb its fears, something fragile is being protected, and something else is being hidden. They were not only symbols of Rome's faith, they were mirrors of its insecurity. And that, perhaps, is why they still unsettle us long after the fire went dark.